It all began innocently enough, or so it seemed. In 1984, 3 teenagers from Oslo formed a band as an act of rebellion. Erstein Arseth, aka Euronymous, Jorn Stuberud, aka Necrobutcher, and Kjetil Mannheim started out covering their favorite extreme metal songs. But what started as a passion eventually evolved into some of the more gruesome deaths, the most vile actions, and chaos all around Norway. How did music get to such an extreme point? The teenagers were inspired by the darkest forms of metal and horror, which was a reaction against the cheery mainstream and glam metal of the era. Even at the start, the band embraced a sinister aesthetic. They wore black, sang of Satan and sadism, and chose a name that hinted at chaos: Mayhem. It was a bold declaration that they sought perversity and craziness beyond ordinary bounds. From the beginning, Euronymous positioned himself as a leader in creating something truly evil-sounding. Mayhem's early recordings, like the raw 1987 Death Crush EP, started to put Norwegian black metal on the map. But the true turning point came when this band's lineup changed in 1988. Mannheim and original singer Maniac both departed, making way for 2 new members who would drastically alter Mayhem's destiny. One was Jan Axel Blomberg, nicknamed Hellhammer, an explosive drummer who would become a Mayhem mainstay. The other was a young Swedish vocalist named Per Yngve Olin, better known by the ominous moniker Dead. Mayhem's most iconic lineup was thus born, and with it, a descent into unprecedented darkness began. When Dead joined Mayhem in 1988, it was immediately clear that he was unlike any singer in metal, perhaps unlike any person at all. From his earliest days, Dead was morbidly obsessed with death. In fact, his nickname wasn't just for show. Friends believed he literally saw himself as not among the living. Some even speculated he suffered from Cotard syndrome, a rare delusion of being a walking corpse. By his own account, Dead's fascination with mortality dated back to a childhood trauma. At 10 years old, he was brutally beaten by bullies and suffered a ruptured spleen, leaving him clinically dead for several minutes before doctors revived him. That brush with the afterlife left a permanent mark on the young boy's psyche. Death had touched him, and he never truly forgot it. Dead made a grand entry into Mayhem's world. In a bid to grab the band's attention, he mailed them a demo tape of his previous band, Morbid, along with a mysterious token, a dead mouse crucified on a cross. This grisly package impressed Mayhem. It was the perfect resume for a band seeking the extreme. Once in Norway, Dead took Mayhem's image and performances to new extremes. He was one of the first to wear the now classic corpse paint, black and white makeup that gave him the pallor of a cadaver. Dead actually wanted to look like a corpse. He didn't do it to look cool, recalled Necrobutcher, of his new vocalist's ghoulish appearance. To achieve that rotting funeral aura, Dead would bury his stage clothes in the ground for days, then dig them up to wear on the night of a show. He even carried around a dead crow in a bag and sniffed it before performances so he could sing with the stench of death in his nostrils. Everything about Dead blurred the lines between performance and morbid reality. On stage, he was even more shocking. Dead would routinely self-harm during concerts, slicing his arms with hunting knives or broken glass, spraying blood to the horror or delight of onlookers. At one infamous show, he cut himself so deeply that he had to be hospitalized, but not before baptizing the front rows in blood. Mayhem also amped up the gore by impaling pig and sheep heads on stakes at the front of the stage. The intent was clear: Only the most hardcore fans could stomach a Mayhem show. Dead once bragged that at a gig they started with 300 people, but after flinging mutilated pig heads into the crowd, only 50 diehards remained. If someone doesn't like blood and rotten flesh, they can F off. And that's exactly what they do, he snarled. It was as if Dead wanted to prove he truly came from the grave and was dragging the audience partway into it. Yet behind his terrifying stage persona was a deeply troubled soul. Offstage, Dead was introverted, eerie, and often sunk in depression. He talked of visions of his blood freezing in his veins and of feeling like he was literally dead. His bandmates found him bizarre and distant. Even Euronymous admitted, "I honestly think Dead is mentally insane." The combination of his mental state and the band's toxic theatrics was a ticking time bomb. As Mayhem retreated to a rural house to rehearse for their first album, tensions between Dead and Euronymous grew dangerously high. They lived together in isolation, and the two strong-willed, extreme personalities clashed. Dead hated any soft music, so when Euronymous blared synth or pop just to provoke him, Dead would flee into the woods and sleep among the trees. Euronymous would follow, firing a shotgun into the air to further unnerve his volatile singer. In one scuffle, Dead even stabbed Euronymous, according to later claims. The friendship had curdled into something dark. Little did they know their escalating game of death was about to turn all too real. On April 8, 1991, the darkness overtook Dead completely. At age 22, Dead committed suicide in the band's shared house, ending his life in a manner as gruesome as his stage persona had foreshadowed. He slit his wrists and throat with a knife, then shot himself in the head with a shotgun. The scene he left behind was nothing short of horrific. His blood-soaked suicide note apologized, simply, "Excuse all the blood," and explained, "I am not human, this is only a dream, and I soon will be awake." As if he truly believed he was never meant for this world. For a final touch of morbid poetry, he left lyrics to a song called Life Eternal by his body. Dead had lived and died entirely according to his macabre obsessions. What happened next has become one of the most infamous episodes in rock history. Euronymous, the band's guitarist and self-styled mastermind, discovered Dead's body. Finding the doors locked, he climbed in through an open window and came upon the ghastly sight of his friend's corpse. By all accounts, Euronymous' first reaction was not to call the police, but to act. He left the house, went to a nearby store and purchased a disposable camera, then returned to rearrange items around Dead's body and take multiple photographs of the bloody scene. One of these gruesome photos eventually became album art. The bootleg live album, Dawn of the Black Hearts, was released in 1995 with Dead's corpse on the cover. But Euronymous' morbid opportunism didn't stop at photography. Legend has it that Euronymous collected fragments of Dead's shattered skull and other remains. He allegedly sent pieces of the skull to fellow black metal musicians as macabre relics, crafting necklaces from the bone shards. In time, he even boasted that he had cooked and eaten a stew made from Dead's brains. The band later denied any cannibalism, but confirmed the part about the skull necklaces being true. Years later, one of these skull fragments would surface for sale with a chilling letter from Euronymous. "I'm enclosing a little piece from Dead's cranium, in case you'd like to have it." It's as if Euronymous wanted to turn Dead's death into a twisted mythos for Mayhem, and he largely succeeded. When Euronymous finally informed his bandmate Necro Butcher about Dead's suicide, His tone was disturbingly enthusiastic. "Dead has done something really cool. He killed himself," Euronymous said, as if proud of the spectacle. He eagerly described the photos he'd taken and the gruesome souvenirs he collected. Necrobutcher was horrified. He said that he was in shock and grief, but Euronymous was just thinking about how to exploit it. Necrobutcher's anguish quickly turned into anger. He told Euronymous to destroy the pictures and, disgusted by his friend's ghoulish behavior, quit the band immediately. To Necrobutcher, Euronymous had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, exploiting their singer's tragedy for clout and evil credibility. Mayhem was effectively shattered, with their vocalist dead by his own hand and the bassist gone in protest. Only Euronymous and Hellhammer were left standing amid the literal bloodbath. Euronymous didn't shy away from using Dead's suicide to further cultivate Mayhem's diabolical image. He told anyone who would listen that Dead killed himself because the black metal scene had become trendy and commercial, and he portrayed the suicide as a sort of martyrdom for true evil. In the underground metal press, Euronymous was gleefully spreading rumors, hinting that he ate Dead's brain skull, boasting of the skull fragments, and generally turning the event into a gruesome legend. Sickening as it was, this tactic worked to an extent. The notoriety of Dead's suicide and Euronymous' morbid promotion of it gave black metal unprecedented mystique and attention. As one account noted, after Dead's suicide, the rumors born from it spread. The genre started gaining steady momentum. This is exactly what Euronymous wanted, but it also sowed seeds of hatred and distrust within the scene. Many began to view Euronymous as a callous manipulator who reveled in a friend's death. The band's first era ended in blood and betrayal. The stage was set for still darker deeds. If you're liking this story so far, click the thumbs up. Thanks. With Mayhem temporarily in shambles after Dead's demise, Euronymous turned his efforts to expanding the black metal movement he had helped spark. In May 1991, just weeks after the suicide, he opened an ominous little record shop in Oslo called Helvete, which is Norwegian for hell. Helvete wasn't just a store, it became the de facto headquarters for a cult-like group of extreme metal devotees. In the dimly lit basement of Helvete, a who's who of the nascent Norwegian black metal scene gathered regularly. This inner circle, later sensationalized in the media as the Black Metal Inner Circle, or simply the Black Circle, included members of Mayhem and other rising bands. There you could find Bard Faust Ethan, who was the drummer of Emperor, and Snorre Blackthorn Ruch, who was the guitarist of Thorns, and later a Mayhem associate. There was also a young, intense musician named Varg Vikernes, who belonged to the one-man band Burzum. The Helvete basement meetings were a breeding ground for a new wave of extremism that soon went beyond music. Fueled by nihilistic philosophies and anti-Christian sentiment, some members of the Black Circle started plotting acts of real-world destruction. Euronymous styled himself as a pure theistic Satanist, preaching pure hatred of Christianity and modern society. Others, like Varg Vikernes, brought in their own twisted ideologies. Vikernes in particular espoused a blend of pagan Odinism and neo-Nazi beliefs, caring less about Satan and more about wiping away Christianity to restore ancient Norse pagan culture. This toxic cocktail of beliefs found a brutal outlet, a wave of church burnings that would soon shock Norway and grab international headlines. It started on June 6, 1992, a date deliberately chosen for its ominous symbolism, 6/6. That night, Norway's historic Fantoftstava Church, a beautiful 12th century wooden church in Bergen, went up in flames. The once peaceful country woke up to find one of its cultural treasures reduced to smoldering ash. At first, authorities didn't suspect arson. It seemed too outrageous that someone would deliberately incinerate the church. But as weeks passed, more churches began burning across Norway. One after another, old churches and chapels were torched by night. Fear gripped the public. Who was doing this, and why? In early 1993, at least 7 churches had been burned down, and it was clear these fires were no accidents. The police and media were baffled and increasingly alarmed. Rumors swirled of satanic cults and devil worshippers on a rampage. Inside the Black Circle, however, the culprits were hiding in plain sight. Encouraged by Euronymous' anti-Christian rants, Vikernes had secretly taken it upon himself to ignite this crusade of arson. Not long after the Fantoft church fire, Vikernes privately boasted to Euronymous and a few others that he was the one who burned it. Euronymous was astonished. They had talked and even joked about burning churches as the ultimate rebellion, but now one of his comrades had actually done it. Far from being appalled, Euronymous was thrilled. The symbolic act of desecrating a church fit perfectly into their extremist vision, and for Vikernes it was an adrenaline rush he couldn't resist repeating. Soon, other members of the circle either participated in or at least supported the escalating arsons. Each new church that fell victim to flames only heightened their notoriety. The black metal scene, once a musical subculture, was now literally at war with Christendom in Norway. One of the fires had deadly consequences. In Sarpsborg, a man was killed. A firefighter lost his life battling a blaze at one of the targeted churches. The crimes were no longer just property damage. They had claimed a human life. This only intensified the media furor. The press dubbed the shadowy arsonists as a satanic terrorist group. Every church leader and politician in Norway was on edge, and the Black Circle reveled in the chaos they'd created. They showed no remorse. In fact, Vikernes and the others saw these acts as righteous. Vikernes, viewing himself as a pagan warrior, felt churches deserved immolation because they stood on ancient Viking holy sites and represented an alien religion imposed on Norway. Burning them was a cleansing, a revenge for the old gods, he claimed. Emboldened, the extremists didn't stop at arson. In August 1992, another crime rocked the country. Murder. Bård Faust Eithen, a respected member of the Circle and drummer for Emperor, killed a stranger in cold blood. Faust was walking home one night in Lillehammer when a man approached and propositioned him for sex. Faust lured the man, Manja Andreasen, into a nearby forest under the pretense of accepting, then stabbed him 37 times, leaving him dead. The victim was gay, but Faust later claimed the killing wasn't about homophobia, so much as an opportunistic urge to know what murder felt like. Chillingly, when Faust returned to Helvete and the news reported a killing in Lillehammer, he confessed to Euronymous and Vikernes immediately. He showed no regret, as if he'd just completed an ordinary task. The Black Circle closed ranks around him. At this time, police had no suspects and his friends kept his secret. In their nihilistic world, even murder could be considered a badge of honor. By late 1992, the Norwegian media was in a frenzy over these crimes. Satanism and black metal were plastered on front pages, but remarkably, the authorities were still struggling to pin them on anyone. Sensing an opportunity for infamy, Vikernes decided to step into the spotlight, a decision that would have drastic consequences. In January 1993, using his stage name Count Grishnok, Vikernes gave an anonymous interview to a major newspaper, Bergens Tidende. In this interview, headlined, "We Lit the Fires," he more or less took credit for the church burnings and even alluded to Faust's murder of a homosexual man. He spoke grandiosely about spreading fear and evil, claiming the acts in the name of black metal's war on Christianity. It was equal parts boast and calculated publicity stunt. Vikernes later said he gave the interview to boost the scene's infamy and to promote his own band Barzum's upcoming album. Indeed, Barzum's next EP, Aske, meaning ashes, featured a charred ruin of a church, Fantoft, on its cover, and even included a free lighter in the first 1,000 copies, a wicked little inside joke celebrating the arsons. The interview had an immediate effect. Police swiftly arrested Vikernes the day the story ran. It turns out the journalist had alerted authorities prior to publishing, suspecting this count might be the arsonist they sought. However, Vikernes had been careful not to outright incriminate himself or others in the recorded portion of the interview. After a few weeks in custody with insufficient evidence, he was released. But the damage to the Black Circle was done. The anonymous mystique was gone. Now the police and press had a name and face to watch. Euronymous was furious. The unwanted attention was bad for him. He feared it would bring the hammer down on all of them. In fact, as soon as Vikernes was arrested, Euronymous panicked and shut down Helvete because his parents, who owned the building, were alarmed by the press and told him to close shop. This closed the chapter on the Helvete era. The aftershocks of Vikernes' publicity stunt were only beginning to be felt within the Brotherhood. The black metal scene was now under siege from law enforcement, and internal tensions reached a boiling point. Different factions and egos within the circle had begun to clash. Threats were exchanged, paranoia set in. Euronymous and Vikernes, once close collaborators in crime, started to turn on each other. Some say Euronymous was enraged that Vikernes had usurped the spotlight and risked their operation. Others point to personal and financial disputes, as Vikernes had his own musical project called Barzum and accused Euronymous, who ran Death Like Silence Productions, of stiffing him on payments and delaying Barzum's record release. All he did was sit on his fat arse in his shop eating kebab, Vikernes sneered about Euronymous' work ethic, claiming Euronymous owed him money. For his part, Euronymous was said to be uncomfortable with how Vikernes' notoriety was eclipsing his own. He had been the self-proclaimed leader of this evil revolution, and now his protege threatened to outshine and endanger him. Amid this toxic mix of pride, fear, and resentment, whispers of murder began circulating. Euronymous, according to some friends, talked openly about getting rid of Vikernes, boasting that he might stun him with a taser gun and torture him to death on video. Vikernes got wind of these threats, and whether he believed them fully or not, he certainly decided to act before Euronymous could. The friendship that had once spawned a campaign of terror was about to implode in spectacularly violent fashion. Oh yeah, real quick, hit subscribe if you want me to do more stories like this. Thanks again. Now let's keep going. The culmination of Mayhem's dark saga arrived on August 9, 1993. Vikernes and fellow musician Snorre Blackthorn Rouge set out on a long drive from Bergen to Oslo, a journey of over 500 kilometers, ostensibly to visit Euronymous. Officially, Vikernes claimed he was going to deliver Euronymous a signed contract for the upcoming Mayhem album and then tell him to fuck off, effectively quitting their partnership. But in truth, he went armed and ready for blood. Late that night, the two arrived at Euronymous' apartment building. Blackthorn, nervous about the whole affair, stayed outside smoking in the stairwell. Vikernes knocked on Euronymous' door alone. When Euronymous let him in, an argument and physical fight broke out almost immediately. Vikernes later said Euronymous attacked first, even kicking him in the chest, and then fled toward the kitchen, perhaps to grab a weapon. Vikernes was armed with a knife. He chased Euronymous down and a struggle ensued. When it was over, Euronymous lay dead in his underwear at the top of a stairwell, having been stabbed 23 times, with wounds to the head, neck, and back. It was ferocious killing. 2 stab wounds to the skull, 5 to the neck, and 16 to the back, indicating that many blows were delivered after Euronymous was already down. Vikernes would later absurdly claim that many of those cuts were from broken glass that Euronymous fell on during the scuffle. The forensic evidence and sheer number of injuries, including fatal stab thrusts to the head, painted a picture of overkill, an act of rage or premeditation, not self-defense. Vikernes has given his version of that night multiple times, insisting he acted in self-defense because he believed Euronymous was plotting to murder him first. According to Vikernes, he confronted Euronymous that night about alleged plans to torture and kill him, calling Euronymous a Lappish communist, a derogatory reference to his Sami ancestry, and asking why he wanted him dead. He claims Euronymous then panicked and attacked, forcing Vikernes to stab him in a struggle for his own life. Vikernes also cited ideological differences, Euronymous' leftist leaning versus his own neo-Nazi beliefs, personal hatred as underlying reasons. However, few accept Vikernes' story of self-defense at face value, especially since Euronymous' injuries included so many wounds to his back. One of the stab wounds severed an artery in Euronymous' thigh, likely the cause of death, and another pierced his skull. It's hard to imagine those as accidental in the heat of a struggle. In any case, whatever his intent, Vikernes had eliminated his rival in the most brutal way. After the deed, Vikernes did not stick around. He hurried to dispose of the bloody clothes by weighing them down with rocks and sinking them in a lake. He then concocted an alibi. He and Blackthorne drove home to Bergen through the night. He had Blackthorne's credit card used at a video rental shop in Bergen early the next morning to leave a time-stamped clue that they'd never left town. But the cover-up didn't hold. Blackthorne was deeply shaken by the murder and eventually confessed everything to the police. Moreover, Vikernes' bragging in the months prior and the police's surveillance meant he was already a prime suspect. It turned out the authorities had wiretapped some of the extremists' phones, and they knew Vikernes had discussed a plan to confront or even kill Euronymous in advance. So, when Euronymous was found dead, it didn't take long. Varg Vikernes was arrested within days of the murder. The trial in 1994 was a media sensation. Vikernes, only 21 years old, appeared disturbingly nonchalant in court. At one point, he famously smiled on hearing his sentence. He was convicted of first-degree murder as well as for several church arsons and for possession of 150 kilograms of explosives stashed in his home. The judge gave him Norway's maximum sentence, 21 years in prison. In Norway's system at the time, 21 years was effectively a life sentence, with the possibility of extensions. Snorre Blackthorne Ruch was also convicted as an accessory and received an 8-year sentence. Blackthorne later explained he felt trapped and afraid of Vikernes, which is why he went along, but the court still held him partly accountable. Suddenly, Norwegian black metal wasn't just an underground curiosity. It was in headlines as a real-life horror story of music turned to murder. As one journalist put it, Norwegian black metal was no longer perceived as a musical genre, but a murderous cult. Fans and musicians alike were stunned. Euronymous, the man who had cultivated an image of ultimate evil, was gone at 25, slain by the even more fanatical protege he had brought into Mayhem. The scene had literally devoured itself. Within the band Mayhem, reactions were complex. Remember, Necrobutcher had quit back in 1991, bitter at Euronymous' treatment of Dead. In a startling revelation decades later, Necrobutcher admitted in a 2019 interview that at the time of Euronymous' death, he himself had been thinking of killing Euronymous out of vengeance. Upon hearing of the murder in 1993, Necrobutcher's own first thought was to clear out his house of anything incriminating, assuming the police might suspect him next. That's how poisonous relationships between Mayhem had begun. Two ex-bandmates separately contemplated murdering their one-time friend. In a macabre twist of fate, Vikernes' act saved Euronymous from a potential plot against him by another colleague. Meanwhile, Hellhammer, Mayhem's drummer, had lost his closest ally in the band. Yet even he had to concede that Euronymous had been playing a dangerous game. There were rumors Euronymous had indeed talked about killing Varg, though whether he meant it seriously will never be known. It was a time of deep threats and chest-thumping within the scene, where talk of murder became shockingly casual. As another black metal musician observed, before you know it, it's not a big deal to kill a man. The members had egged each other on into a frenzy where normal moral lines vanished. With Vikernes behind bars and Euronymous in the grave, Mayhem as a band was effectively finished, at least for a time. Only Hellhammer remained active, and the name Mayhem was tainted by the blood of its founder. Yet remarkably, the music lived on. In May 1994, just weeks after Vikernes was convicted, Mayhem's long-awaited debut album, the Mysteriis Dom Sathanas, finally saw the light of day. This album had been recorded in 1992 and 93, with Euronymous on guitar, Hellhammer on drums, Dead's replacement Attila Shihar on vocals, and Vikernes on bass. Its release had been delayed due to the murder and due to a sensitive request from Euronymous' grieving parents. They were understandably horrified that their son's killer would appear as a performer on his album. Hellhammer promised Euronymous' family that he would re-record Varg's bass parts before release. In the end, however, he did not do so, perhaps lacking the ability or will, and they quietly released the album with Vikernes' bass lines intact, simply omitting his name from the credits. Thus, the Mysteriis Dom Sathanas came out as both a tribute to Euronymous and a haunting epitaph of that era, featuring the playing of the man who murdered him. Even in death and disgrace, Mayhem's art and infamy were inextricably intertwined. Varg Vikernes settled into prison life as comfortably as one can, quickly regaining his defiant posture. He showed no remorse for killing Euronymous, quite the opposite. He often justified it as necessary or even righteous. While incarcerated, Vikernes remained productive in spreading his dark ethos. He continued to write and compose music for his solo project Burzum, recording several albums in prison using only synthesizers for lack of other instruments. At first, no major label would touch a convicted murderer's work, but eventually, a German company, Misanthropy Records, run by an underground metal enthusiast, released his prison-made albums. Vikernes also used his time to write manifestos and books expounding on his racialist neo-pagan ideology and his take on black metal's philosophy. In 2003, he made headlines again by escaping prison. He failed to return from a short leave and was found driving a stolen car with weapons, apparently trying to flee because he believed someone was out to kill him. He was quickly recaptured at gunpoint after a chase, and his parole date was pushed back. Ultimately, Vikernes served about 15 years of his 21-year sentence and was paroled in 2009. Upon release, Vikernes moved to rural France with his wife and children, attempting a quiet life, but controversy still followed. In 2013, French authorities arrested him on suspicion of plotting terrorism, fearing he might plan a massacre after he was found to have received a manifesto from far-right terrorist Anders Breivik. Though no violent plot was proven and he was released, Vikernes was convicted of hate speech and given a suspended sentence for propagating racist and anti-Semitic ideas online. Indeed, he had become an outspoken extremist on his blog and YouTube, railing against Jews and celebrating ancient pagan warrior culture. YouTube eventually deleted his channel in 2019 for hate speech violations. Unrepentant as ever, Vikernes even criticized Breivik, not for murdering 77 people in Norway's worst modern massacre, but for not targeting the real enemies, the Jews. And he mocked Breivik's mostly teenage victims as cowards. These vile statements showed that Vikernes remained steeped in hateful ideology long after his black metal days. As of today, Varg Vikernes lives free, legally renamed to Louis Cachet, occasionally surfacing in the media to defend his past and spew his beliefs. The other key figures each went down very different paths after 1993. Faust, the murderer of the gay man in Lillehammer, was arrested in 1993 after a fellow musician tipped off police. He confessed and was sentenced to 14 years for that killing and for participating in burning a church, Holmenkollen Chapel, alongside Euronymous and Vikernes. Faust served his time and was released in 2003, later rejoining the metal scene and even performing with Emperor again. A controversial comeback, though he expressed regret for his crime. Snorre Blackthorn Rouge, after serving his 8-year term for abetting Euronymous' murder, went on to continue his music quietly, most notably reviving his influential band Thorns. And what of Mayhem, the band itself? One would think the band could never survive such carnage, but in a twist, Mayhem would rise again a few years later. The mid-1990s saw a resurgence. In 1995, drummer Hellhammer and bassist Necrobutcher decided to reform Mayhem, bringing back Maniac and recruiting a new guitarist, Rune Eriksson, nicknamed Blasphemer. This reunion was met with both excitement and skepticism in the metal community. Some were thrilled that Mayhem, now legendary for its infamy, would make new music. Others thought it sacrilegious. How could Mayhem exist without Euronymous, the very soul of the band? Yet, in true defiant spirit, Mayhem forged on. They released an EP, Wolfslayer Abyss, in 1997, a ferocious comeback that proved the band still had venom in its veins. The reformed Mayhem of the late 90s and 2000s was a different beast in some ways. It was older and more musically experimental, but the aura of controversy remained. If anything, the band seemed to embrace the infamy as part of their identity, continuing to stoke flames. One early controversy in Mayhem's second act came within the band. Drummer Hellhammer, notorious for his extreme views, allegedly voiced racist white supremacist opinions, for example, speaking against race mixing and lamenting foreigners in Norway, combined with the band's occasional use of Nazi imagery like swastika flags in their rehearsal space and a stylized Totenkopf skull logo on merch, led many to accuse Mayhem of neo-Nazi sympathies. Hellhammer at one point even said he didn't want black people in his scene. These comments provoked outrage and tarnished the band's reputation. The band members tried to downplay it. "The satanic stuff isn't what I feel Mayhem is about today," Hellhammer said in 1998, noting that the band's music was still dark but not necessarily focused on devil worship. On stage, the new Mayhem also maintained the band's tradition of chaotic, violent performances, sometimes with unintended consequences. In 2003, during a concert in Norway, the band threw a severed sheep's head from the stage into the audience. This time, though, it caused serious injury. A fan, named Per Christian Hagen, was struck in the head by the flying sheep skull and suffered a fractured skull himself. The incident made headlines and authorities briefly considered charges. Mayhem insisted it was an accident. They hadn't meant for the projectile to actually hit anyone. But the story only cemented Mayhem's reputation for mayhem. Fans now not only risked ear damage at their shows, but apparently blunt force trauma from airborne animal parts. Internally, the band still dealt with turmoil. Vocalist Maniac, who had rejoined in the 90s, struggled with severe alcoholism and stage fright, which worsened as the band kept touring. His performances became erratic and tensions flared between him and guitarist Blasphemer. In one ugly incident, Blasphemer physically attacked Maniac, reportedly kicking him down a flight of stairs after a show, due to Maniac's drunken behavior affecting their performance. This altercation proved the last straw. In 2004, Maniac was out of the scene, and Mayhem once again turned to Attila Schihar, the Hungarian singer who had contributed vocals to the Mysteriis Dom Sathanas, to return as frontman. Attila's return brought stability, and his eerie vocal style reinvigorated the band for their next chapter. Of course, trouble kept finding Mayhem. In 2009, while on tour in the Netherlands, the band members, perhaps reliving the old days, got arrested for vandalizing a hotel room, causing thousands in damage during a night of excess. Today, more than 30 years since the blood-soaked events that made Mayhem infamous, the band is still active, performing and recording with a mix of old and new members. Bassist Necro Butcher and drummer Hellhammer, both founding-era members who lived through the darkest days, continue to carry the torch. In an almost poetic milestone, Mayhem was inducted into the Norwegian Rockheim Hall of Fame in 2021, a recognition by the establishment of their impact on music. It's a twist no one could have predicted in the 90s, when the band was considered a national menace. In their induction, they stand as the only black metal band with that honor, symbolizing how a culture can eventually absorb even its most wayward children. In the tale of Mayhem, the controversies are many and the truths sometimes elusive, but one thing is certain: this band's history is one of the most intriguing and harrowing in all of music. Now, I discovered heavy metal when I was in elementary school. I was drawn to the dark imagery, the aggressive energy, the rush of adrenaline I got from listening to it blasting in my headphones. Ozzy, Kiss, Twisted Sister, Quiet Riot, and other bands of those days pushed the buttons of the so-called moral majority and stirred up controversy with the way they dressed and onstage antics. The story of Mayhem is so far onto another level, it's like, what the hell? Talented, but seriously messed up. Well, this one goes out to all my fellow metalheads out there. I love discovering new metal bands to listen to, so if you have any suggestions I should check out, throw their names into the comments below and I'll check them out. I'll see you again on another Friday with more unusual, unsettling, and sometimes unsolved